Tonight, I want you to come with me, not as a tourist, but as a witness. I've spent years reading parish rolls, sketching maps of frozen rivers, and listening to the hushed accounts that survive in the margins of monks' notebooks. Tonight, I'll take you into a medieval winter the way I approach a sleeping village, softly, step by step, careful not to wake the past. I promise this is not a lecture. Consider it a slow, steady walk through cold and small mercies. If you let the words be the hearth, let them warm your hands. Dim the light. Find a blanket. If you have a small noise machine or a fan, turn it on. The steady hum helps. This channel, Restful History Hub, does history quietly. I tell stories so your mind can rest inside them, not because the past is pretty, but because it is honest. Winter didn't arrive overnight. It arrived like a bill you couldn't pay, gradual, inevitable, and heavy. The trees seemed to fold their branches away from the sky. Animals changed their routes. People started speaking in shorter sentences, as if words cost heat. In my research, I read about that slow tightening. Scholars call parts of this period the Little Ice Age. One theory says cold spells came in waves, not a single catastrophe, but repeated tests of endurance. For many, the season was not about a single event, but about learning to make a life on a smaller scale. I once followed a woman named Edda through a winter in a village by the marsh. Her name appears in a single bread tally and a prayer list, nothing more. But in that tally, she recorded how many loaves she could spare, and I imagine her hands, raw and steady, folding dough in a smoky kitchen. She had a dog, a small gray mutt, who didn't bark much, but slept beside her feet and warmed her ankles. One night, when the wind came like a thief, the dog nosed a coal back into life. Small things, like a warm paw, kept people going. If you love animals, let that image sit with you, a thin creature offering warmth when nothing else will. Here's a quiet question I want you to hold. How do you measure a winter? By the days that pass, by the frost that marks the window, or by the small economies of survival? For medieval people, measurement meant counting bundles of wood, eggs kept for later, and how many pairs of hands were healthy enough to work. You will hear me count those things tonight, not as a historian marking data, but as a companion who notes what matters when heat is scarce. I will rehook you now. If you are here to drift off, remember this channel is built for that purpose. I narrate slowly on purpose. I pause. I return to small comforts. If you worry about spoilers, there are none. These are not tales of victory, but of endurance. And endurance is patient by design. Before we go deeper, a firm word. If you prefer loud excitement, flashy facts, or quick lists, this is not the place for you. Do not press subscribe if your phone is a bedside siren. Subscribe only if you want to be gently guided to sleep through history. Reverse psychology, perhaps, but consider this. If I asked you to stay awake, you'd want to do the opposite. So, if you're tempted to skip, stay. If you're tempted to close this tab and chase adrenaline, close it now and come back tomorrow when you need to rest. Now breathe slowly. I am a historian, and tonight I'll tell you what winter smelled like, how it felt on hands that had no gloves, and why a village learned to think in coals. Let the sound of my voice be steady. Let the scenes unfold like embers, small, patient, and warm enough to hold your attention without startling you. We begin with the first gray mornings, the way a day shrinks like bread into breadcrumbs, and we move through to how communities kept the present from collapsing into despair. Stay comfortable, stay curious in a quiet way, and if the story eases you toward sleep, that's the only proof I ask for. Otherwise, keep listening and let the past tuck you in. Tonight, I will move slowly, never rushing, and stay beside the hearth until you drift. The mornings in those winters were a kind of silence you could hear. I remember writing in my notes, "The world sounds different when everything is frozen." You woke not to birds, but to the soft cracking of ice inside the water bucket. The air had weight. Breathing felt like sipping metal. Every sound traveled farther. The creak of a cart axle, the cough of a neighbor, even the shuffle of a hen's feet in the yard, all carried through the cold like echoes inside glass. I walked through what used to be a village in the Low Countries, just a few ridges of earth now, but if you listen close, you can almost hear it. They built their cottages from wattle and daub wood, straw, mud, and faith. The walls breathed cold air, no insulation, just texture between people and the wind. Scholars say an average peasant home leaked heat like a flute leaks music, constant, unending. You couldn't keep warmth in, only chase it from 1 hour to the next. I can imagine their mornings, rising before the faint sun, hands cracked and stiff, eyes half open from the smoke of the fire that never truly went out. They'd stir the ashes, blow gently, coax the faint red back into orange. If you've ever nursed a campfire at dawn, you know the sound, a faint whisper of life returning. For them, that wasn't ambience, that was survival. Etta, the woman I mentioned, would reach for her dog first. He slept curled tight in a circle, nose tucked beneath his tail. When she stirred, he followed, padding across the straw, shaking off frost that had gathered on his fur. The dog was warmth before the fire was. I think about that often, how medieval love was rarely spoken, only practiced. A dog that didn't leave your side was love. A neighbor who shared his last onion was love. In a world that harsh, affection was a verb, not a word. The roof above her, thatched, sagging, but still standing, hissed softly when frost melted through it. You can almost smell it. Wet straw, smoke, boiled barley, and the sour tang of animal breath. That was the perfume of a medieval winter. The sound of a cough wasn't illness, it was life, proof someone still breathed. When I read these accounts, some written by monks, others reconstructed from tax rolls, I realize they all circle the same truth. Winter wasn't an event, it was a personality. It had moods, tempers, and grudges. One theory says even minor temperature drops reshaped harvests for decades, carving entire generations around the memory of cold. The past didn't just remember winter, it was built by it. So tonight, as you listen, imagine that world not as a painting, but as something breathing just beneath your own room's quiet. The fire you see in your mind, small, flickering, defiant, that's where we'll stay for now. Because every story of survival begins there. A spark, a small animal warming your feet, and a world outside that has forgotten how to be gentle. By mid-morning, the light sharpened, thin, colorless, like it had been strained through ice. I always thought the strangest thing about winter sunlight was its honesty. It never pretended to warm you. It simply arrived, cold and exact, laying bare every breath, every flake of frost clinging to the thatch. In the journals of a 14th century cleric from York, he wrote, "The sun shows itself, but never shares itself." That line has stayed with me for years. You could tell the season's depth by the way the village moved. Slowly, not from laziness, but from calculation. Each step was rationed like grain. Every errand, every task, every breath had a cost in energy, and energy was as precious as firewood. When you live in cold that never ends, you start thinking like a mathematician of warmth, which logs to burn, which to save, which corner of the room gets the last of the light. I once tried to imagine how I'd fare there, me, a historian with soft hands and central heating, cutting wood with numb fingers, boiling water just to keep it from freezing again. The record Experts say even fetching water was an ordeal. Streams iced over by November, wells crusted with frost, so thick it took a hammer to break through. You didn't wash, you chipped ice for cooking, for drinking, for everything, and yet life didn't stop. It shrank, it folded itself inward. People huddled closer, both from necessity and from a shared understanding that solitude was dangerous. Too much silence made the mind wander to places colder than any field. So they filled the quiet with sound, soft singing, gossip, the rhythmic clack of spinning wheels. The sound of labor was a lullaby against despair. Etta would hum when she worked, low, tuneless, but steady. Her dog, always near, would tilt his head and sigh as if he understood the melody. I like to think he did. She'd drop crumbs from her bread, and he'd catch them midair, small moments that broke the monotony. Scholars say medieval peasants sang while they spun wool or patched clothes, not for joy, but to keep rhythm, to keep sane. There's a wisdom in that, in matching your body's pace to something musical when the world offers nothing else. When I visited the remains of her village, just soil mounds and a half-buried hearthstone, I caught myself whispering aloud, "That's what this season does to you. It teaches reverence. The quiet demands it." Even centuries later, you feel compelled to speak softly, as though your voice might shatter what peace the place still holds. If you're listening to this in bed, breathing slow, let that hush wrap around you. It's the same silence Etta heard after the chores were done, the moment when the house stopped creaking and the dog settled near her feet. That silence isn't empty. It's full of breath, memory, and the quiet mathematics of survival. And if you're still awake, let me remind you, this isn't just a story about cold. It's about how people learned to live inside it. Keep listening. The night's only begun to fall. By afternoon, frost no longer felt like an invader. It felt like a neighbor. You didn't fight it anymore. You learned to live around it. Old chronicles say this. A monk from Flanders once wrote, "Winter humbles a man until he learns its language." And I think that's true still. You stop demanding warmth and start negotiating with the cold in whispers, chores, quiet patience. The air changed, how people behaved. No one wasted words. The market square, once loud with barter and laughter, became a place of nods and gestures. Breath froze mid-sentence, hanging like smoke before disappearing. You spoke less. Sound seemed to lose heat as it traveled. Imagine that, a silence so complete it felt holy. It made language feel fragile. Inside, Etta worked the loom by the fire, her dog belly down on the warm stones. The shuttle's rhythm back and forth was almost hypnotic, a small comfort against the slow ache of time. Every few hours, she'd feed the fire, breaking small branches first, saving thick logs for night. The smell of burning pine filled the room, sweet, resinous, ancient. Her cottage wasn't much larger than a stable, but it held the essentials: heat, hunger, heartbeat. I've read inventories from similar homes. They list possessions like prayers, an iron pot, a cracked bowl, 2 wool blankets, 3 candles, a wooden icon of the Virgin. It's not much, but in scarcity, the few things you own become extensions of your will to survive. The pot that cooks your stew becomes part of you, the blanket, a second skin, the fire, an altar you tend with devotion. Outdoors, the world was blue, not the cheerful kind, but the deep, metallic blue of shadowed snow. Even the animals moved differently. Goats grew quieter. Hens refused to leave the coop. Etta's dog stepped out only to leave paw prints on the hard earth, then darted back, shivering, pressing close to her legs, as if apologizing for its brief rebellion. Sometimes she'd laugh, a small, breathless sound that startled even her. In the endless gray, laughter was a luxury. There's a theory I like. Medieval winters made people spiritual, not by choice, but by exposure. When everything outside threatens to erase you, you look inward, praying not for comfort, but for continuity. Survival itself became a kind of faith. Each fire lit was a declaration. We're still here. Maybe that's the heart of every winter story, the quiet insistence that life refuses to quit. Even now, reading her records centuries later, I feel that same defiance pulsing through time. It's not loud. It doesn't need to be. It just burns small, steady, unstoppable. If your eyes are heavy, that's all right. Let the rhythm slow you. Picture the fire shrinking to embers, Edda's dog breathing softly, the sound of the loom fading. The night presses close, but you're safe for now. This is what winter taught them, and what I hope it teaches you before you sleep. That endurance isn't noise. It's silence held long enough to see the dawn. Evening came early, as it always did. The horizon folded into gray, and daylight retreated without apology. You could mark the hour not by the sun, but by how far the cold crept across the floor. By the time the light dimmed to nothing, every surface, the spoon, the door latch, even the breath on the window, wore a shimmer of frost. This was the hour when fear and fatigue traded places. The work was done, but rest never came easily. A 13th century monk from Wuisburg wrote, "Night in winter is not dark, it is thinking." Silence had weight. It pressed on you. Every creak in the beams, every groan from the wind, every cough from a neighbor's hut made the mind build stories out of sound. Edda's fire burned low. The wood pile was half its size, and it wasn't even mid-season. She rationed it like a bookkeeper. A few twigs for warmth now, one thicker log for later, none tomorrow if the sky promised snow. Her dog stirred when she moved, sensing her restlessness, lifting his head to watch her hands. Animals understand routine better than humans. He knew the rhythm of her movements, the tilt of her head, the soft click of her tongue when she wanted him near. Sometimes she talked to him as she worked, murmurs, a mix of endearments and half-thought prayers. The sound kept them alive. Records of this companionship appear in estate rolls and letters. "The hound," one farmer wrote, "kept my spirit from freezing." It's easy to overlook the emotional architecture of survival, the small bonds that stitched life together when everything else fell apart. Outside, wolves prowled closer, their howls carried for miles across frozen fields, sharp and ghost-like. Villagers hung charms above their doors, carved bones, rosemary, bits of iron. No one believed they worked, but belief wasn't the point. The act of hanging them was. You did what you could, even if all you could do was pretend. Edda's cottage, walls glowed orange, firelight flickering against the wattle and daub. Smoke coiled through the roof hole, drifting upward before the wind shredded it. She pulled her cloak tighter, checked on the dog, then settled near the hearth with her spindle. Her fingers worked automatically, twisting wool into thread. The motion was steady, like thought itself, endless, circular, necessary. When I imagine those nights, I think about exhaustion. It wasn't the kind that sends you to bed. It hollowed you slowly. Yet in that hollow space, peace found room to sit. That's what fascinates me about the Middle Ages, not hardship, but the quiet acceptance of it. Scholars say it built a strange resilience, a grace born from repetition. So as you listen now, feel that rhythm, the spindle turning, the dog sighing, the wind pressing its cold face against the window. The sound doesn't demand attention, it releases it. Let your mind drift, not away from the story, but deeper into it, because this is the pulse of the medieval night, slow, smoky, and soft enough to carry you toward sleep. Sometime after midnight, the The wind rose, not a storm, not yet, but a warning. The rafters groaned as if the house were bracing for what came next. In her sleep, Etta stirred. The dog lifted his head, ears twitching toward the door. He didn't bark. He never did. He simply listened, the way animals do when the world speaks in tones we can't quite hear. I've read winter chronicles, brittle pages, brown ink, Latin notes in trembling hands. They all agree on one thing. When the wind changes direction in winter, something's coming. God's breath, one monk called it, testing the patience of men. Scholars say these storms arrived without pattern, part of the unpredictable chill that marked the early 1300, when temperatures fell so low they froze rivers. It wasn't a single bad year, it was a generation of them. Etta woke when the first draft slipped through the wall. She rose, pulled her shawl tight, and checked the fire. Only embers left, dull red, barely breathing. With practiced hands, she laid in a few twigs, coaxing life from near nothing. The dog pressed close, tail curled, eyes following the glow. Outside, snow whispered against the door, soft but insistent. This was the part of winter that tested everyone. Not hunger, not labor, but waiting. Waiting for storms to pass, for wood to dry, for light to return. Days and nights blurred into one long conversation between hope and resignation. I once found a letter from a farmer's wife during a harsh February. The wind has no mercy, and we have no wood. My husband prays for sleep, for it is the only time he forgets the cold. Sleep wasn't rest, it was refuge. Inside Etta's cottage, that line felt true. She sat by the fire, watching shadows move across the floor, and listened to the roof tremble. She wasn't afraid. Fear was too tiring to keep. Instead, she moved with calm precision, checking the latch, shifting the pot from the draft, whispering a prayer half from habit, half from memory. Her dog leaned into her leg, eyes half closed, as if to remind her she wasn't alone. When I visited that region, standing where her village once stood, the wind still spoke the same language, low, steady, eternal. You realize then that history isn't silent. It hums beneath your feet. Every gust carries the echo of hands that built fires, voices that prayed, lives that endured. If you're listening now, wrapped in a blanket, remember, the same wind that haunted her walls once touched these stories into being. And now its only sound distant, harmless, softened by time. Let it move through your imagination, not as a threat, but as a lullaby. The storm outside her door will come and go, as all storms do. But for now, she's safe, her fire alive, her companion watching, her world small but intact. As she settles back onto her straw bed, the wind sighs through the thatch like a tired spirit finding rest. Close your eyes too. The night is long, yes, but not endless. The cold, like every story, fades by dawn. By dawn, the world was white, not soft, storybook white, but the blinding, merciless kind that swallows every sound and shape until only silence remains. Snow had drifted halfway up the door, turning the cottage into a sealed box of breath and smoke. For a moment, Etta thought the world outside had ended in the night. She wasn't wrong to wonder. I've read chronicles from the winter of 1315, the first year of what historians call the Great Famine. That spring never came. Rain froze before it could feed the crops. Fields drowned in ice. It was as if heaven forgot its seasons. One monk wrote, grain prices tripled, livestock died in their stalls, and people whispered that God had turned away. Scholars now think volcanic ash or ocean shifts caused those endless cold rains, but to them it was divine displeasure, made visible in frost. Etta didn't know the science. All she knew was that the bread she'd baked the week before had turned to stone. and the patch of turnips behind her house lay buried beneath a silver grave. Her dog pawed at the door, restless, his breath puffing ghosts into the air. She opened it just enough for him to slip out. He bounded through the snow, leaving tiny constellations of paw prints before circling back, tail wagging, as if proud to prove the world was still there. There's something human about that, the instinct to check if life still answers back. In winter, you need reminders that you're not alone, that the world still moves even when it feels frozen. Villagers found those reminders in small things: the cry of a crow, the trickle of a thawed stream, the sound of church bells. Bells were lifelines. They marked time when sunlight couldn't, tolling through fog and storm to say, "You are still here." Etta listened for them too. Some mornings, she thought she heard them, faint, ghostly chimes rolling across the snow. Whether real or imagined, didn't matter. The sound steadied her hands. She'd gather what would remain, feed the fire, and set water to boil, even if there was nothing to cook in it. The motion was its own comfort. I often think about how people survived days like that. Not heroically, not dramatically, just persistently. One chronicler wrote, "The people did not fight the cold. They became it." That feels right. You stop seeing winter as an enemy and start carrying it inside you, letting it shape your pace, your expectations, even your dreams. Outside, the sky bruised pale blue. The wind slowed. The snow glittered in weak light, like powdered glass. Etta's dog curled beside her feet again, content, as if he knew the worst had passed. Inside that small cottage, between smoke and silence, the world held steady, fragile, but alive. And if you're still with me, eyes heavy, let that image be your shelter. A woman, her dog, a thin fire, and a world so cold it glows. The lesson isn't in the suffering, it's in the endurance. They didn't wait for comfort. They made it, one ember at a time. By midday, the snow settled into stillness, the kind that made the world seem paused between breaths. Roofs sagged under its weight, paths disappeared, and the horizon blurred into nothing. From her window, a hole covered with oiled parchment, Etta saw only white and shadow. She leaned close, breath fogging the thin film, tracing a small circle just to look out. The air beyond was motionless. Even the crows had given up. It's strange how quickly a person adjusts to deprivation. In her world, silence was no longer empty. It was a companion. You could hear the smallest sounds, the crackle of sap in the firewood, the sigh of the dog shifting in sleep, the occasional drip from the thawing thatch above. Those sounds became proof the world still moved, however slowly. A medieval proverb said, "The snow buries all pride." It makes sense. Winter didn't care who you were, serf, knight, or monk. It reduced everyone to the same set of problems: hunger, warmth, endurance. A king could sit in a stone hall and still feel the same ache in his fingers that a farmer did. Scholars call it the great equalizer of the Middle Ages. I call it the season of humility. Etta fed the fire again, then pulled her cloak tighter. Her dog stirred, stretched, and wandered to her lap, laying his head there with a soft grunt. She smiled faintly and scratched behind his ear. You can imagine the sound: a thump of tail against the floor, a single exhale softening the room. Those small moments that shared warmth were the medieval version of grace. Later, she took out her spindle, twisting wool into thread. Her rhythm matched the quiet, slow, deliberate, almost meditative. Women in her time often spun during storms, not for productivity, but to steady their minds. The act was repetitive, predictable, something solid in a world that changed without warning. One historian said this kind of rhythm eased panic the way breathing exercises do today. The science may be new, but the instinct isn't. Outside, the snow finally stopped. The sky opened just enough for light to spill through, and the village shimmered under it. Every roof, every fence post, every frozen branch dressed in gold for a moment. It wouldn't last, but when light returns after darkness, even briefly, it rewrites the world. You remember beauty can survive hardship. Etta stood at her door with the dog beside her, watching sunlight drift across the field. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence had become her prayer as she turned back inside, pulling the door tight. I like to think she felt what we all crave when the world grows hard, a fragile but real sense that maybe, just maybe, she could endure one more night. So if you're still awake, breathe in that same pause, the one between storm and calm, fear and rest, because that's where peace lives, not in the warmth you dream of, but in the quiet you learn to live inside. That evening, the light faded slower than usual, a small mercy. The horizon burned orange for a few minutes, then melted into blue-gray shadow. For once, the wind didn't rise. The stillness that followed wasn't comfort, but close enough to make Etta pause. She took it as a sign to step outside. The snow, hardened by cold, held her weight. Each step made a soft crunch that echoed through the valley. Her dog followed, weaving around her legs, nose down, tail wagging cautiously. Steam rose from his breath. The air was sharp, the kind that cut when you breathed too deep. From the ridge, she saw neighboring huts, faint, quiet, each marked by a single column of smoke curling upward. Somewhere far off, a bell tolled, muffled by distance. Bells meant time still existed. Bells meant someone was still alive to ring them. I once read in a parish record from Burgundy that during the coldest winters, bells rang more often, not to mark hours, but to remind villages the world hadn't frozen completely. The ringing, the scribe wrote, was to keep despair from setting like ice in the soul. I think about that whenever I hear a distant chime. Sound is proof of movement, and movement means life. Etta knelt, scooping a handful of snow. She let it melt against her skin, watching drops freeze again on the ground. There was poetry in that, warmth too brief to last, but beautiful while it lived. Her dog nudged her hand, and she laughed, quiet and hoarse, her breath breaking in the cold. That sound, a single note of life in a sleeping world, was worth more than gold. Back inside, she lit a small tallow candle. The flame wavered, reflected in the dog's dark eyes. Shadows swayed across the wall. She whispered a prayer, not for spring or food, but for steadiness. She didn't ask for ease, she asked for endurance. That was the difference between hope and fantasy. An old chronicle said medieval people didn't dream of comfort, they dreamed of continuity. To see another dawn, it read, was reward enough for faith. Etta embodied that without knowing it. She didn't speak philosophy, but she lived it. In every small gesture, every repaired roof, every night she refused to let the fire die. Her dog lay against her side. As she closed her eyes, the fire cracked. The candle burned slow, dripping wax that cooled into tiny shapes on the table. In that faint glow, the room felt timeless, a space where nothing mattered but the breath between two beings keeping each other alive. And if you're hearing this now, let that image settle in you. A small house wrapped in snow, one woman and one loyal companion, both breathing slow, steady, unafraid. The world outside may be frozen, but inside, in this story, in your room, warmth still wins. Not loudly, not suddenly, but persistently, because that's how every winter ends, not with a sunrise, but with someone choosing to keep the light burning until it comes. That night, the cold deepened until it felt personal, as if the air itself knew who could endure it and who could not. The walls moaned softly, the kind that makes you believe a house can suffer. Inside, Etta wrapped herself in every scrap of fabric, cloak, blanket, shawl, layering them like armor against the unseen cold. Her dog nestled beside her, trembling but loyal. I've read enough winter accounts to know heat then wasn't only physical, it was mental. One scholar wrote, warmth was a state of mind as much as a state of body. They learned to feel heat where there was none, in faith, in memory, in shared breath. The poor didn't survive through fire alone. They survived because they remembered what warmth felt like. Etta stirred the embers, coaxing a faint glow into flame. The act was ritual, as sacred as prayer. The wood hissed, smoke curled upward, and for a moment the room brightened. Her dog's eyes caught the light, like two tiny suns. She smiled faintly, whispered something, maybe a name, maybe thanks, and leaned closer to the fire. Outside, snow glittered under moonlight, 1,000 mirrors, catching what little light remained. Silence held everything. No wind, no bird, no bell, just the heartbeat of fire and the slow breathing of two survivors. In that quiet, time thickened, the world waiting for permission to move again. I think about that, what silence meant to them. Today, we flee from it, fill it with noise and motion. But in the medieval world, silence was an ecosystem where thoughts ripened, faith was tested, people met themselves. A monk once wrote, God lives in the pauses between sound. Etta seemed to know that. Her life was a pause between harvest seasons, storms. She reached for the loaf on the table, hard as stone, but edible when soaked. She broke off a piece, dipped it in warm water, and gave the first bite to her dog. He took it gently, tail thumping the floor. Small mercy shared between species. That's how love looked then, not grand, just survival together. As she ate, the fire snapped, sending up sparks that danced like fireflies against the smoke-stained walls. For a heartbeat, the room looked alive again, full of warmth and light, then settled into stillness. Etta closed her eyes, listening to the crackle and the slow rhythm of her companion's breath. That was enough. She didn't need music or laughter, just proof life still moved beside her. If you're still awake, imagine that sound, fire breathing slow, wind resting, the world holding its breath. You don't need to chase sleep, it will find you. The mind, like the hearth, glows when you stop forcing the flame. Let this be your stillness, your medieval silence, patient and warm. Even in the hardest winters, peace wasn't something they waited for. It was something they built, one quiet heartbeat at a time. Morning came reluctantly, dragging a dim gray light through the shutters. It wasn't dawn so much as a faint lifting of darkness, a truce between night and day. The fire had died to ash, and the air in the cottage was brittle like glass about to shatter. Etta stirred beneath her cloak, slow and deliberate, as if movement itself required permission. The first sound was the dog, stretching, yawning, his claws clicking softly against the floor. He shook himself, sending a small flurry into the air, then pressed his nose to Etta's hand. That simple gesture pulled her fully awake. She smiled without meaning to. Most mornings began that way, not with sunlight or song, but with a nudge from something that still believed in her. A 14th century friar once wrote, "We woke not to life, but to the duty of continuing it." It sounds grim, but it's quietly heroic. Every day survived in that age was defiance. You didn't wait for comfort, you made it. You didn't hope for miracles, you became one by not quitting. Etta moved to the hearth, knelt, and sifted through the ashes. Beneath the gray dust, a few coals still glowed, stubborn as memory. She blew on them gently until a small flame rose, fragile but alive. The dog tilted his head, tail tapping, as if he too saw victory in that tiny resurrection. Outside, the snow had begun to sink under its own weight. Icicles hung from the eaves, dripping into a bucket below. The sound, soft, steady, predictable, felt like music after so many silent days. I imagine her pausing to listen, eyes half closed, letting that rhythm remind her the world still moved. When winters lasted that long, you measured time by proof of change. She stepped out to fetch wood from the shed. The sky was silver, the air so cold it burned her throat. In the distance, she saw a neighbor, a figure hunched against the wind, dragging a sled of kindling. They didn't wave or call, just shared a glance that said, "We're still here." That was enough. Back inside, she warmed her hands over the revived flame, then tore a small piece of bread for breakfast, giving half to the dog without hesitation. That's the dignity of survival, sharing even when there isn't enough. Historians write of famine and plague in numbers, but truth lives in moments like this. 1 loaf, 2 lives, no waste. History often underestimates tenderness. It records kings and wars, but forgets mornings like this. A woman feeding her dog, breathing steam into a half-lit room. This is where civilization lived, in persistence, in care, in refusing to let the cold win. If you're still awake, let your breathing match hers. Slow, steady, deliberate. You don't need grand hope to survive your winters. You just need the small flame that refuses to die. Hold that image, Etta by the hearth, the dog at her feet, the snow melting 1 drop at a time. That's what every medieval dawn meant. Not rebirth or redemption, but quiet continuation. By midday, a fragile rhythm had returned to the world, the kind that feels earned, not given. The sky was still colorless, the air sharp, but the storm had passed, leaving behind a silence that was less threat, more thought. Etta took it as a sign to tend to what little life remained outside her door. The snow still clung to everything. She brushed it off her wood, her shoulders, even the fence marking her garden. The ground beneath was hard as stone. Last summer's roots jutted up like bones, reminders of what once thrived. Her dog followed close, paws sinking into the powder, tail swaying in lazy arcs. Every few steps, he paused to sniff the frozen ground, as if searching for something lost beneath it. A peasant in Bavaria once wrote, "Winter teaches the soul to count smaller blessings. You begin with food, fire, and company, and when those shrink, you count breath, heartbeat, and silence that doesn't hurt." That's how they survived endless winters, not through abundance, but redefinition. Etta leaned on the fence, gazing at the pale horizon. Smoke from distant chimneys curled upward, delicate and uncertain. Somewhere behind the woods came the faint crack of axes, men cutting the last of the green wood before frost claimed it. That sound, the deep thud of survival, carried like a far-off heartbeat. Her dog barked once, sharp and sudden. She looked down to see him pawing at the snow near the fence. Beneath it lay a small brown shape, a frozen bird, light as a dream and twice as fragile. Etta knelt, brushing it clean with her fingers. She stared for a moment, not in horror, but in recognition. The dog whined softly. Then, with quiet grace, she lifted the little body, wrapped it in a scrap of linen, and placed it beneath an old tree. There were no prayers for small creatures then, no time, no ritual, but Etta bowed her head anyway. Maybe it wasn't prayer, but something simpler, a moment of shared mortality. She knew the line between her and that bird was thin as ice, and gratitude was the only proper response. She turned toward her cottage, her dog trotting beside her. Inside, the air had cooled again, the fire sinking low. She fed it a log, stirring coals until they breathed color back into the room. The flickering light painted the walls gold for a heartbeat, and in that warmth, the world felt gentle again. There's an old theory, whispered by medieval scholars, that the soul grows heavier in winter and lighter with thanks. Etta, without knowing, lived that truth. Gratitude wasn't thought, it was action, feeding a fire, burying a bird, sharing bread. If you're still listening, let that linger. Gratitude doesn't always sound like joy. Sometimes it's quiet acceptance, a sigh after struggle, the soft click of a dog's claws returning to your side. That's the rhythm of survival, not triumphant, but tender. The world may freeze, but as long as something inside you moves, even gently, winter cannot win. That night, the temperature dropped again, not violently, but steadily, like a patient adversary reclaiming ground. The stars were so bright they looked close enough to touch, scattered over the black sky, like frost on iron. The village slept beneath them, each home its own small universe of smoke and breath. Etta sat near her fire, too tired to spin, too restless to sleep. The dog dozed beside her, chest rising and falling in rhythm with the flame. She stared into the embers until they began to move like memories. It's strange how fire can feel alive, the way it shifts, the way it seems to think. People once believed every flame carried a spirit. Charms have been found scratched into old hearthstones, prayers to the keepers of warmth. Maybe it wasn't superstition, but gratitude. When something saves your life every day, it earns a name. Etta leaned closer, murmuring softly to the fire. "Stay with me," she might have said. The dog opened one eye, sighed, and sank deeper into the straw. The house creaked, the kind of sound that feels both comforting and watchful, as if the walls themselves were listening. I've walked through ruins where homes like hers once stood. Under the right wind, you can hear a faint whistle through broken stone. It sounds like breathing. That's when you realize they were just like us. Same fears, same hunger for safety. We read their world through numbers. They lived it through heartbeat. Outside, frost crawled across the window, turning glass to lace. Its beauty was cruel, breathtaking, but cold enough to kill. Medieval poets called it winter's script. They believed the frost was the earth writing to heaven, sending prayers in crystal language. Maybe that's what Etta saw too, messages written in ice, vanishing by morning. She reached out to her dog, resting a hand on his back. His fur was warm, his heartbeat steady. That connection, living heat shared between two beings, was worth more than any sermon. It reminded her that even in the deepest cold, something still answered back. She closed her eyes and drifted to fields of grain, to the sound of running water. The mind knew how to build escape routes. Scholars say dreams then were vivid, sometimes mistaken for visions. When the body couldn't travel, the imagination did. Maybe Etta dreamed that night of summer, of her dog chasing birds instead of curling near the fire. Maybe she dreamed not of what was real, but what kept her human. As the hours deepened and the fire shrank to its faintest glow, the world turned perfectly still, perfectly patient. If your eyes are heavy now, let that stillness reach you too. Breathe with the rhythm of her world, slow, steady, unhurried. Every winter, no matter how endless, has this moment when the night is longest, the fire smallest, and yet life still hums quietly in the dark. By morning, the world had hardened into crystal. Every twig, every blade of grass, every tool outside was sealed in ice. When Etta opened her door, the hinges screamed, a long metallic groan that shattered the silence. She pulled her shawl tight and stepped into a light, so pale it hurt to look at. The snow no longer looked soft, it glittered like crushed glass. Her dog trotted ahead, leaving delicate paw prints that vanished as frost crept back over them. The air was still, too still. It's a silence you only hear in deep winter, not peace, but suspension, as if the world itself had stopped breathing. A 14th century weather chronicle described such mornings. The earth lies closed like a book no one dares open. The medieval world was obsessed with signs. Every frost pattern, every shift in the wind meant something. When the air froze like this, people said God had gone quiet. Not gone, just quiet. Watching, Etta walked toward the village well. It wasn't far, but in snow that deep, every step was a negotiation. She carried a small bucket, its handle wrapped in cloth so her skin wouldn't stick to the metal. The dog followed, snout low, alert. The well stood at the center of the hamlet, a ring of stone rimed white. She peered down. The rope was stiff, the bucket frozen into the ice. It would take hours to free it. Still, she pulled on the rope, testing its strength, breath rising in clouds. The dog barked once, sharp and echoing. A cluster of crows startled from a nearby roof, rising like spilled ink against the sky. Etta smiled faintly, not because anything was funny, but because motion itself was reassuring. In a world frozen still, a bird's flight proved not everything obeyed the cold. She turned back home, hands stiff, but resolve unbroken. Inside, the fire waited like a friend, faint but loyal. She knelt, fed it, coaxed it to life. The smell of wood smoke filled the room again. Her dog came to her side, shaking off snow. She rubbed his ears, whispering gratitude. In her world, warmth was never assumed. Even a small flame felt miraculous. Scholars say the human bond with fire shaped medieval faith. People saw in it both danger and salvation, a mirror of their own fragility. To tend flame was to tend life itself. As the fire grew stronger, Etta set her bucket beside it, letting the ice begin to melt. Drop by drop, the water returned. That faint tapping was the first music of the day. She watched it, hands in her lap, her dog asleep at her feet. The scene is simple: a woman, a fire, a dog, a melting bucket. Yet it carries everything history tries to measure: patience, care, endurance. If you're still listening, let that sound of melting water steady you. Every drop is proof that no winter, however endless, is absolute. The ice always yields slowly, quietly, but without fail. And that's the secret the past keeps offering. Survival isn't a fight, it's a wait, a long, steady wait for thaw. By afternoon, a timid sun broke through the clouds, not warm enough to change anything, but bright enough to make the snow shimmer. Etta stood by the doorway, eyes half closed against the glare. The air still bit at her cheeks, but something in it had shifted. The cold no longer felt cruel, it felt clear. She walked toward the forest, not far, just enough to remember the world still existed beyond her walls. The dog bounded ahead, his energy a small rebellion against stillness. His paws kicked soft bursts of frost, his tail a rhythm of quiet joy. In that moment, she realized he never doubted survival. He didn't pray or despair. He simply lived, trusting in motion. Scholars say animals taught medieval people resilience. In bestiaries, those books of beasts, the dog stood for loyalty and endurance. The hound keeps watch. One scribe wrote, "For the soul forgets what the heart remembers." Maybe Etta had heard that once in church, or maybe she didn't need to, she lived it. The forest greeted her with quiet authority. Icicles hung from branches, trunks dark beneath glassy coats. Every few steps, snow dropped from a limb with a soft thud, startling both woman and dog. She laughed, just to hear the sound. Laughter came rarely. It felt like cracking ice inside her chest. She gathered fallen branches, brushing off frost. The wood was damp, but still useful. Her dog circled her, nose twitching at unseen scents. Somewhere deeper, a deer moved, a ripple of motion, a crack of twigs. The world, despite everything, was alive. On her way back, she stopped near a hill where snow drifted deep. The dog began digging, sending sprays of powder into the air. Beneath it, he uncovered a scrap of fabric, maybe a lost glove, maybe nothing. Etta took it gently and smiled. Even a small relic was proof of continuity, that someone before her had stood in this same cold, touched this same earth, endured this same silence. Historians say survival is memory in disguise. To endure is to keep the story alive for the next soul. Etta understood that. Her quiet acts, tending fire, sharing bread, walking through snow, were small chapters in humanity's tale of persistence. When she reached her cottage, smoke rose straight into the pale sky. The fire inside waited faithfully. She dropped the wood, shook frost from her cloak, and crouched beside the dog. "Good work," she whispered. He wagged once, then rested his head on her knee. That's the kind of victory history forgets. Not battles won, but fires rekindled, footsteps retraced, breaths still drawn in bitter air. So if you're still here, listening, maybe half asleep, let this image be your comfort. A woman, her companion, and a single spark holding back the night. Because survival begins not with strength, but with gentleness, the quiet choice to keep moving through the cold, one small act of care at a time. That evening, the clouds folded back over the sky like a closing book. The brief sunlight was gone, and the cold returned, sharper now, a reminder not to grow comfortable. Inside Etta's cottage, there was rhythm again. Fire, breath, motion, rest. She moved through it like a ritual she no longer needed to think about. The dog followed in lazy circles, settling wherever she settled. Dinner, if it could be called that, was simple. Thin broth, a few scraps of root, and the last piece of bread for morning. She tore it in half, handing the larger portion to the dog. He sniffed, then took it gently, curling beside the hearth. There was something sacred in that exchange, a silent covenant that outlasted even faith. A Cistercian monk once wrote, "Charity is not the gift of gold, but the sharing of fire." That line fits Etta's world perfectly. In a time when little could be spared, generosity looked like heat or bread or a few moments of safety. Survival was never solo. It was communal, even if your only companion had 4 legs and a heartbeat. Outside, the wind began its slow moan, brushing the door like a hand, testing for weakness. Etta didn't flinch. She'd learned to listen without fear, to hear its language without panic. The cold was not a stranger anymore. It was a teacher, stern but honest. It reminded her that life had to be tended like a flame, constantly, carefully, with reverence. She lay near the hearth, the warmth from the stones seeping into her bones. Firelight flickered across her face, gold against pale exhaustion. Her dog shifted closer, pressing his back to her stomach, his breathing syncing with hers. In that small cocoon of heat and fur, the world outside ceased to exist. If you've ever listened to a quiet house in winter, you know that sound. The low hum of stillness, the sigh of wood in heat. It isn't silence. It's something deeper, like the world whispering it's safe to rest. Scholars say this was the hour most people found peace, when work ended, when hunger dulled, when even fear paused. It was the hour of surrender. Etta's eyes fluttered, heavy with fatigue. The fire was still alive, but she no longer feared it dying. She'd learned its rhythm, how it waned and returned, like breath, like faith. She reached toward her dog, resting her hand on his back. The gesture wasn't habit, it was gratitude. He sighed, tail brushing her arm before sleep claimed him. Something inside her maybe memory, maybe spirit softened. She wasn't waiting for spring anymore or counting days. She was simply existing wholly within the long patience of winter. If your breathing has slowed, let it match hers, calm and accepting. This was what medieval nights truly were. Long, cold, human. No miracle thaw, just warmth earned, peace held, and the quiet pride of surviving one more night. The wind could scrape the walls, all it wanted. Inside, two small lives burned brighter than any storm. By morning, the wind had softened to a whisper, not gone, but gentler, as if it too had grown tired of its own voice. The sky hung low and gray, the kind that hummed more than shone. Etta woke slowly, her body heavy with the ache of endurance. The dog was already up, sitting at the door, ears twitching toward the muted light. For the first time in days, she heard something new, the faint dripping of thaw. Water slid from the eaves, collecting in the frozen grooves of the earth. She sat up, listening, unsure whether to trust it. It could be a trick, a brief reprieve before the cold returned. But the sound held steady, undeniable. The first thaw always came quietly. An old English farming ledger once said spring began not by sight, but by sound. When the drip begins, it raid. Hope returns to the soil. To us, it's poetry. To them, it was prophecy. Etta rose, joints stiff but obedient. She opened the door, and a thin mist greeted her, wet, cold, but alive. The snow hadn't melted, but it sagged in places, and the air smelled faintly of earth again. Her dog bounded forward, paws sinking, nose pressed to the ground. He barked once, sharp, joyful, then circled as if to declare victory over the cold. She smiled, the first real one in weeks, not wide but true. That sound of water, that shift in air, felt like forgiveness. Maybe not from heaven, but from the world itself. The storm had done its worst, and they had endured. Inside, she placed another log on the fire, not from desperation, but routine. The flame caught easily, burning clear. Its light no longer felt defensive, it felt celebratory. She brewed a thin tea from dried leaves she'd saved. The scent, faint, herbal, grounding, filled the room. She poured a little into a wooden bowl for the dog. He lapped it eagerly, tail brushing her leg. It's in these small acts, tea, warmth, company, that civilization hides. The chronicles never mention such things. They're too ordinary, but that's what matters. History remembers kings, yet it's the ordinary who teach endurance. They didn't seek legacy, they sought tomorrow. Etta sat by the fire, cup in hand, watching steam curl upward. The dog rested his chin on her knee, eyes half closed, utterly content. In that moment, time loosened. She wasn't thinking about famine or faith or what waited beyond winter. She was simply there, alive, breathing, part of the quiet rhythm of the world starting again. If you're still listening, let that image hold you. A faint thaw, a warm hearth, and two survivors sharing silence that no longer hurts. You don't need to chase spring, it will come on its own. Just breathe slow like Etta does now. Because this is the truth every age relearns. Survival isn't strength, it's gentleness repeated long enough to outlast the cold. By late afternoon, the thaw had grown bolder. You could hear it now, the rhythmic dripping from roofs, the soft cracking of ice, the sigh of snow surrendering to gravity. What had once been a world of stillness was now a quiet orchestra of change. Etta stood at her door, listening. The sound was uneven, clumsy, alive. Every drop felt like a heartbeat restarting after too long a silence. Her dog darted through puddles, paws splashing, fur damp but tail high. He barked once at his reflection in the meltwater, then looked back as if to say, "See, the world moves again." She laughed, a laugh born of relief more than joy. tossed him a small scrap of bread. He caught it midair, proud as a king. Records from the 14th century describe this same moment after long freezes. The people, one monk wrote, weep at the sound of melting. He wasn't being poetic. The thaw meant survival. It meant another planting season might come, that hunger could loosen its grip. In their world, the sound of water was a hymn of resurrection. Etta fetched a wooden pail and stepped toward the stream beyond the cottages. It had been a ribbon of ice for months, but now a thin trickle ran along its center, timid, crystalline, unstoppable. She knelt, cupping the cold water in her hands. The shock stung her palms, but she didn't flinch. She drank slowly, eyes closing, and for the first time in weeks, her thirst was met by something that didn't taste of smoke. There's a theory that early people felt the seasons as personalities. Winter was a stern teacher, spring a shy guest knocking at the door, and this moment between them was sacred. It taught humility, patience, gratitude, lessons comfort could never teach. Etta filled her pail and turned home, the dog bounding ahead. As she walked, she noticed things unseen for months. Brown grass tips poking through ice, a cluster of ravens quarreling, the faint scent of earth under snow. The world was raw, scarred, but breathing again. Inside, she poured the clean water into her pot, setting it by the fire to warm. Steam rose, curling into the rafters. Her dog curled at her feet, content and drowsy, paws twitching as he dreamed. She brushed her fingers through his fur. "You did well," she whispered. Maybe she meant both of them. Outside, the wind carried a softer note, warmer at its edges. It pressed against the cottage like a promise. Etta closed her eyes and listened, and for the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt full of sound, full of meaning, full of tomorrow. If you're still awake, let the drip of meltwater linger in your mind. That's what renewal truly sounds like, not sudden or loud, but patient and sure, because even the longest winters don't end in thunder. They end in the smallest sounds, a drop, a sigh, a breath, reminding us that life never really stops. It just waits for the thaw. By dusk, the mist had thickened, that gray that blurs the edges of things and makes the world feel like it's dreaming. The snow, once sharp and glittering, had softened into slush, and the scent of wet soil crept through the air. It wasn't pleasant, but it was alive. Etta stood at the doorway, hand on the frame, watching steam rise from the ground, as if the land itself were exhaling after a long fever. The dog sat beside her, ears forward, nose twitching. Somewhere in the distance, a faint trickle of water broke the silence, the stream finding its voice again after months of ice. That sound loosened something inside, a knot she hadn't known she carried. I once read a diary fragment, anonymous, around 1320, that said, when the thaw came, people smiled like sinners forgiven. Survival bred guilt. They felt unworthy, ashamed of outlasting neighbors who hadn't. The thaw carried ghosts. Etta must have felt that too, a quiet gratitude that she and her small companion were still breathing in a world that had claimed so many. She whispered a prayer, more reflex than faith, tracing a cross in the air, not because heaven owed her anything, but because the gesture gave shape to relief. Some prayers are words, others are just movement, a sigh, a bowed head, a hand resting on a warm body beside you. Her dog nudged her leg, looking up, tail swishing. She smiled faintly, kneeling to meet his gaze. "You hungry?" she murmured. She went inside, broke off what was left of yesterday's bread, and dropped it into the pot of broth, warming over the fire. The smell, faintly sour, faintly sweet, filled the room. She poured a small portion for the dog, another for herself. They ate together, unhurried, The broth wasn't rich, but it was warm, and warmth was everything. Between bites, she stared into the fire, listening from the roof. The rhythm matched her heartbeat, steady and slow. There's something human about that sound. Water returning, earth breathing, the world thawing. It's not dramatic. It's merciful. People have mistaken survival for conquest, but the truth is quieter. Endurance wrapped in patience. It's keeping the flame lit until the wind remembers kindness. Etta leaned back, eyes half closed. The dog finished his meal, licked the bowl clean, and curled beside her, head on her knee. She ran her fingers through his fur, feeling his steady breath. That rhythm, that warmth, her proof of life. Outside, snow melted in fits and starts, dripping from the eaves like the ticking of an old clock, each drop marking not time's passing, but its persistence. If you're still here, if your eyes are heavy, let that rhythm become yours. Each drip, each breath, a reminder that everything hard softens and everything frozen yields, because that's the truth winters whispered to those who endured them. The world never ends with cold. It ends with the quiet return of sound, the music of things learning to live again. That night, the air held a strange warmth, thin, uncertain, like a promise the world wasn't sure it could keep. The mist outside glowed faintly under the moonlight, turning the village into a painting half erased by breath. Etta sat by the fire, back against the wall, the dog curled close to her hip. She wasn't cold for the first time in months. That alone felt miraculous. The fire burned low, steady, no longer a desperate blaze, but a companionable glow. Its light moved gently across the room, revealing the rough grain of wood, uneven stones, faint carvings on the table's edge, marks from years of use. Every object had earned its place. Survival gave meaning to things that might have been forgotten. I once read a monk's reflection written in the margin of a weather log. It said, "When the cold leaves, gratitude must take its seat before it grows cold too." The writer meant comfort makes people careless, but those who endure remember. They notice small mercies longer, hold them closer. Etta was one of those. She'd learned to live with less, and in that, found peace abundance could never give. She ran her hand through the dog's fur, feeling its warmth, the pulse beneath. He stirred slightly, but didn't wake. The sound of his breathing blended with the crackle of the fire, forming a rhythm both human and hypnotic. You could fall asleep to that sound, and maybe you should. Outside, drops fell from the roof in slow succession. The snow was retreating, but not quietly. Every thaw carried the groan of ice surrendering, the sigh of trees stretching after stillness. In the distance, an owl called, the first sign that night had reclaimed its voice. Etta looked toward the window, at the dim reflection of her face in the frost. She didn't look younger or stronger, just present. Survival hadn't changed her shape, only her understanding. Strength wasn't noise, it was continuity. To live quietly, kindly, without bitterness, that was power. She whispered something, not quite a prayer, not quite a wish. Maybe she was thanking the fire, maybe the silence, maybe the dog, who'd never understand the words, but understood everything else that mattered. The chronicles call that time the long cold, but I think that misses something. Those who lived through it weren't frozen, they were tempered. As iron grows stronger after flame, so did their spirits under frost. Etta, without knowing, was proof of that. The dog shifted, paw pressing against her leg. She smiled faintly, resting her hand on his head. The gesture needed no explanation. It was acknowledgement of survival, of company, of peace hard-earned. If your eyes are heavy now, let them close. Imagine melting snow, the soft pulse of the fire, the calm rhythm of two lives at rest. There's no rush here, no battle left to fight, because this moment is what every medieval winter led toward, not triumph or glory, but stillness. A quiet house, a loyal companion, and a fire that's small but enough. By morning, the thaw had deepened into soft rain. It fell in thin threads that hissed against the roof and ran down the walls like veins of light. The snow collapsed in slow motion, folding back into the soil it had hidden for long. The air smelled of mud and bark, not pleasant, but honest, the scent of a world remembering itself. Etta woke to that sound, disoriented. Rain had become unfamiliar. For months, mornings began with silence and frost. Now, the steady patter on the roof felt like a song she'd forgotten. She sat up slowly, letting the rhythm fill the space. The dog was awake, head tilted toward the sound, tail thumping once in approval. She laughed softly, a fragile, surprised sound, and whispered, "It's rain," saying it made it real. She stood, pulled her cloak close, and opened the door. The air that met her was damp, cold, but soft. The rain touched her skin, and for the first time in weeks, it didn't hurt. It was cool without cruelty. She tilted her head back, eyes closed, and let it fall. A friar once wrote that when rain returned after a hard winter, villagers would stand outside and let it soak them like baptism. "The heavens have remembered us," he said. Maybe that's what this felt like for Etta, not mercy, but recognition. The world had spoken her name again. Her dog stepped into the yard, paws sinking into soft mud. He sniffed, barked once, not in alarm, but joy. He darted forward, chasing rivulets between snow patches, reflection rippling in puddles. She smiled, watching him reclaim joy so easily. Animals never needed permission to be happy. She walked a few paces toward the field, beyond the fence. The land had changed overnight. The white fractured into shades of brown, gray, and green. Grass peeked through. The stream was awake again, gurgling low and uncertain. The sound of life returned, birds, axes, faint voices through the mist. Inside, she peeled off her cloak and hung it near the fire. The smell of wet wool mingled with wood smoke, earthy, grounding. The dog shook himself dry, spraying droplets, then collapsed near the hearth. Content. Etta knelt beside him, pressing her hand to his side. His warmth felt different now, not borrowed, but his own. She fed the fire one more log, not from fear, but gratitude. The light flickered, golden against the damp air. For the first time, she wasn't guarding it like a soldier. She was sharing it like a host. There's an old phrase, patience is a kind of victory. Chroniclers wrote it for endurance, but Etta lived it better. She hadn't conquered winter, she'd outweighted it. That's a quieter triumph, one the world rarely celebrates. If you're still awake, picture this. Rain on a wooden roof, a small fire glowing, a woman and her dog resting while the earth relearns warmth. No speeches, no miracles, no grand finale, just the soft sound of life continuing. Because that's how every story of survival ends, not with noise, but with renewal, so gentle you could sleep through it. By midday, the rain had thinned into mist, a silver curtain drifting through the village like breath from the sky. The snow was nearly gone now, reduced to pale streaks in shadow, the last traces of a season that had outstayed its welcome. Where drifts once stood waist-high, small rivers carved through the mud, carrying away bits of straw and ash. The world, scarred but breathing, was moving again. Etta stepped outside with her bucket, boots sinking into thawing earth. Each step made a soft, sucking sound, the soil reclaiming its shape after months of ice. Her dog padded beside her, cautious at first, then gleeful, splashing through puddles like a creature reborn. He barked at the water, bit at the ripples, spun in circles as if drunk on motion. She laughed, truly laughed, for for the first time since before the frost. The sound startled her, foreign in her own throat, like a forgotten language, returning suddenly. She covered her mouth, half in disbelief, half in gratitude. The dog stopped, head tilted, tail wagging, pleased to have caused it. A village priest once wrote, "When laughter returns, famine ends in the heart before it ends in the field." I think he was right. Survival isn't just physical. The moment you can laugh again, find beauty amid ruin, that's when you've truly endured. Etta walked to the well. The rope, once frozen stiff, now dripped freely. The bucket lowered smoothly, splashing into dark water. She drew it up and watched her reflection break and reform with each drop. She didn't look triumphant. She looked alive, and that was enough. On her way back, she saw movement near the trees. A small herd of deer, cautious but curious. Their ribs showed, but they moved with grace that no winter could erase. The dog tensed to chase, then stopped at her whisper. Together they stood still, life acknowledging life. Back inside, the smell of damp wood filled the air. She poured the water into a clay pot, added a few dried herbs, and set it to warm. Steam rose slowly, curling toward the ceiling like smoke from a prayer. She dipped a cloth into the water and wiped her hands, ritual more than cleanliness. The heat bit her skin, but grounded her. Her dog rested by the fire, eyes half closed. She joined him, lowering herself beside the hearth. Together, they listened to the rain fading into nothing, the quiet softer, fuller, no longer lonely. A 14th century homily once said, "Endurance is not the absence of pain, but the practice of gentleness while it remains." Etta seemed to know that. She hadn't conquered her world, she'd befriended it, even in its cruelty. If you're still listening, let that idea settle in you like warmth, returning to cold hands. Gentleness is the final stage of survival, what's left when struggle no longer defines you. The storm had ended, the thaw had begun, and in a cottage once surrounded by endless snow, a woman, a dog, and a quiet fire waited for the earth to turn green again, patient, peaceful, and alive. By late afternoon, the mist had lifted, revealing a sky the color of pewter, dull, heavy, but open. The kind of sky that made you forget winter had claws. The ground was still slick with meltwater, but here and there, green began to show. Moss on stones, fragile blades of grass pushing through the mud. Etta stood at the doorway, hands on the frame, watching it unfold like the first page of a long-awaited book. The air was thick with scent, wood smoke, thawing soil, the faint sweetness of rot, as snow released what it had buried. She breathed slowly, relearning the act. Her dog sniffed the air too, head high, tail still. That subtle shift in the world's rhythm was the earth stretching after a long sleep. A chronicle from the Low Countries described the first day of thaw as a day without lies. Nothing could hide. Snow, once a blanket, revealed everything it had covered: lost tools, dead branches, forgotten footprints, sometimes worse. Beauty and ruin surfaced together. The past thawed. Etta knew this. Walking toward the fields, she saw what winter had claimed: a broken fence post, a collapsed roof, the outline of a neighbor's cart, half buried in sludge. Each sight was quiet testimony. She didn't turn away. You couldn't, not if you wanted to live honestly with the land. You had to look. You had to remember. Her dog trotted beside her, stopping now and then to sniff something half familiar. Sometimes he barked at nothing, a habit from the long winter, as if chasing ghosts. Etta let him. Some rituals deserved to linger before fading. At the field's edge, she stopped. The soil, dark and wet, glistened under weak light. Steam rose in thin ribbons, earth's breath escaping slowly. She crouched, pressed her palm to the ground, and felt it, faint warmth deep below, still cold above, but life was stirring underneath. She smiled. The land hadn't died, it had only hidden. A scholar once wrote that medieval winters taught patience better than any sermon. The soul learns stillness when the body cannot move, he said. Maybe that's why people like Edda endured. They'd learned the seasons weren't enemies, just teachers with hard lessons. She lingered a while, hand on the soil, until her dog nudged her elbow, urging her home. She rose, brushed mud from her skirt, and followed him toward the glow of her cottage. The fire was waiting, smoke curling from the chimney, a small, proud flag of survival. At the threshold, she looked back once more. Snow was nearly gone, reduced to pale ghosts clinging to shadows. The world, imperfect and soaked with memory, was ready to begin again. If you're still with me, take a long breath. The story isn't about cold anymore, it's about return. How life, even buried beneath silence, never forgets its way back. Every medieval winter ended the same way. Warmth didn't arrive in triumph. It seeped in quietly through thawing ground, through tired hands, through a woman standing barefoot in mud, realizing the worst had passed. That evening, the wind shifted again, not cruel this time, but restless, carrying the damp smell of thawed earth and wet bark. It slipped through the cracks in Edda's cottage, moving the candle flame beside her bed just enough to make it dance. The world was changing, slowly, audibly, and for once, she wasn't afraid of the sound. Her dog slept near the hearth, paws twitching, lost in dreams only animals are allowed to keep. The fire was smaller now, no longer the desperate blaze of survival, but a steady, modest flame. It didn't have to fight anymore. Neither did she. Outside, drops fell from the roof, a rhythm too gentle to call rain, too constant to be silence. It filled the room like a lullaby. She sat for a long while just listening, elbows on her knees, eyes fixed on the hearth's glow. It reminded her of how winter began, with storms that howled, winds that tore, and how those same elements had softened into this, a whisper, a hush, a promise kept. A Benedictine diary once said, "The season ends not when the frost leaves the field, but when the fear leaves the heart." That's the truth, hidden in centuries of endurance. The thaw outside was only half the miracle. The other half was within her. The tension she'd carried, the quiet dread she'd learned to live with, was loosening. She no longer woke, listening for storms. She no longer counted logs before sleeping. Edda moved to check the door, habit more than necessity. She pressed her hand against the wood, felt its coolness, the faint vibration of the wind beyond. That cold no longer frightened her. It felt familiar, almost intimate, like an old adversary turned to truce. She smiled. "You can stay out there," she whispered. "You've done enough." Her dog stirred, lifting his head, eyes glinting in the firelight. She stroked him, tracing the familiar path behind his ears. "Sleep," she murmured. "You've earned it too." His tail thumped once before he sank back into rest. The candle beside her flickered lower, its light mingling with the orange glow of the fire. The walls, rough, uneven, smoke-stained, seemed softer now, their imperfections beautiful in the warmth. Every crack told a story, every shadow felt like a memory. She lay on her cot, pulling the wool blanket to her chin. Outside, the world breathed, melting, dripping, sighing, a tired orchestra of persistence. The wind hummed softly through the thatch, not in threat, but in accompaniment. If you're listening, eyes heavy, let that rhythm carry you. The hardest part has passed. You don't need to hold on so tightly anymore. That's what medieval winter promised, though few believed it until they lived it. That, after the silence, after the hunger, after the endless dark, the world doesn't simply begin again. It forgives, and as Etta drifted into sleep, the last thing she heard was the sound of melting snow, not ending, not beginning, just continuing, the steady heartbeat of a world that had survived itself. The world outside her door had shed its final layer of white. Only small patches of snow lingered in shadows, clinging to the base of trees and north-facing walls. The sky was wide and pale, washed clean by days of rain. For the first time in what felt like forever, color returned. The faint green of grass, the deep brown of earth, and the gold of sunlight, daring to show its face. Etta opened the door slowly, almost reverently, as if she might wake the world too soon. The air was cold but gentle, the kind that reminds you you're alive. She stepped outside, boots sinking softly into the mud, and for a long moment stood still. The wind brushed her cheek, carrying the scent of soil, smoke, and something else, renewal. Her dog bounded ahead, tail high, ears perked, splashing through shallow puddles that glimmered in sunlight. Every movement was joy distilled into motion. He paused to sniff the first sprouts, pushing through the thaw, then barked twice, proud of his discovery. Etta laughed, a low, unguarded sound belonging to spring. In the distance, she could hear life returning, the dull thud of an axe, the creak of a cartwheel finding mud instead of ice, the muffled chatter of neighbors clearing ditches, calling across fields. These were the sounds the chronicles rarely mention, not battles or coronations, but the orchestra of ordinary resurrection. A medieval scholar once wrote, "The thaw teaches men that mercy is slow but certain." People of that age didn't expect sudden deliverance. Grace arrived in increments, drip by drip, day by day, like the melting snow outside Etta's door. She knelt to scoop a handful of soft earth, crumbling it between her fingers. It was wet and cold, but smelled alive. The land had forgiven. She whispered a small blessing, not Latin prayers, but her own quiet words of thanks. Her dog pressed his head against her arm, grounding her. Back inside, she stoked the fire again, though not out of need. It was no longer defense, it was tradition. The light from the hearth and sunlight from the window met at the center of the room. That balance, fire and sky, was something she hadn't seen in months. She sat beside the dog, hand on his back, watching the world brighten inch by inch. There's a peace that comes only after suffering, not relief exactly, but recognition, the understanding that you've met something ancient and survived. Etta didn't feel triumphant, she felt real. Everything unnecessary, fear, pride, noise, had burned away with winter. What was left was the simple, solid weight of being. If you're still here, awake or half asleep, let that feeling wash over you. The storm is gone. The fire is steady. The earth is breathing again. Because this is how medieval winters truly ended, not with fanfare, but with small, living things returning to color. A dog barking at the first shoots of green, a woman whispering thanks to the soil, and a world weary but unbroken, remembering how to begin again. By afternoon, sunlight finally reached places it hadn't touched in months, the corners of Etta's cottage, the hollow between her woodpile and the wall, the narrow strip beneath her window. It was thin, golden, hesitant at first, but unmistakably warm. She moved her hand into it, palm open, and stayed. After so long in the cold, even a small patch of warmth felt sacred. Her dog sprawled lazily in the doorway, soaking in the sun with the abandon only animals know. His fur shimmered, damp in patches from morning play. He stretched, sighed, and rolled onto his back, paws in the air, offering his belly to spring. Etta chuckled quietly, more breath than laughter, and for a fleeting moment, the heaviness of past months lifted. The village beyond her door was stirring. Hammers struck wood, Neighbors exchanged bread or news, the distant toll of the church bell marking midday. It wasn't just a return to work, it was a return to life. For people like her, rebuilding after winter wasn't choice, it was instinct. The thaw meant mending what had broken, replanting what failed, forgiving what had gone. A 14th century chronicler said, "When men hear their neighbors again, despair ends. Isolation makes the cold crueler. Connection, even small, warms the soul first." Etta, though not one for words, felt it. Hearing distant laughter reminded her she belonged to something larger than her cottage walls. She stepped outside with a basket, her aim simple: gather what the earth offered. Beneath soggy hay and frost-bitten soil, she found life: thin shoots of wild onion, stubborn tufts of green. She pulled a few, brushing dirt away, inhaling their sharp scent. Her dog watched, tail wagging, eyes bright with curiosity that carried him through the hardest nights. A medieval saying goes, "The ground remembers mercy before man does." The earth forgives faster than people. Standing there, Etta believed it. The same soil that starved her was now feeding her again, quietly, without apology. She carried the herbs inside and set them near the fire to dry. The cottage smelled alive, part smoke, part onion, part new beginning. She brewed a thin soup, stirred slowly, and poured a portion for her companion. He licked the bowl clean, content, then curled beside her feet. The fire crackled softly, echoing the hum of the day outside. Life had returned, not loud, not triumphant, just steady. In that steadiness was beauty. As evening approached, light poured through the window in long amber lines, painting the room in warmth. Etta sat back, legs folded, hands in her lap. She felt the weight of the season, not gone, but integrated, like a lesson absorbed too deeply to forget. If you're listening, take a breath, one that feels earned. You've walked with her through hunger, frost, silence. Now you've reached sunlight. Don't rush it. Let the warmth land slowly, like dawn across a cold field. This is survival, not joy without memory, but peace carrying the imprint of all endured. A woman, her loyal dog, and a single shaft of light filling a quiet room with grace. By evening, the sunlight had turned to amber, that deep, honey-colored glow that lingers longer than it should. Etta stood at the doorway, hand on the worn wood, eyes half closed. As the last light brushed her face, the sky stretched wide and gentle, streaked with faint pink. The thaw was nearly complete now. Even the puddles had stopped shivering. The world had found its stillness again, not the frozen kind, but the peaceful kind. Her dog sat beside her, tail swaying slow. His ears twitched toward every sound: a crow calling, a cartwheel creaking, the quiet drip of melting snow. He was listening the way animals do, fully, without judgment. She envied that, the ability to exist in sound, not thought. The village had changed tone. You could feel it in the air. The sharp edge of survival had dulled into something softer: cooperation, relief, fatigue. Smoke rose from chimneys, not as signals of desperation, but as signs of life resumed. People mended what winter had broken, but more than that, they'd begun to talk again. Laughter drifted faintly through the mist, cautious but real. There's a record from a 12th century parish ledger, nothing grand, just a note from a priest that reads, "After the thaw, I heard them sing." That's all it says. No sermon, just that line. But to me, that's survival. Not that they rebuilt, but that they remembered how to sing. Etta's song was silence, a silence so full it felt like prayer. She leaned against the doorway, watching her dog chase the last flicker of sunlight. When he stopped and looked back, she smiled, the kind of smile that carried both gratitude and understanding. Neither needed words to mark this victory. Just being here was enough. Inside, the fire burned low, but steady. She didn't stoke it. She didn't need to. Its glow was soft, domestic now. The cold no longer pressed at her walls. The battle had ended quietly in her favor. She sat by the hearth, watching the dog settle onto his blanket, paws tucked beneath his chin. His breathing was slow, the rhythm of a creature who trusts the night again. A medieval mystic once wrote, "Rest is the final prayer of the weary." Etta embodied that truth. She didn't pray for plenty or luck. She prayed through rest by releasing the tension she'd carried too long. That made her strong, not the fight, but the surrender after it. Outside, the moon rose, pale, full, reflected in shallow pools across the thawed fields. The world shimmered faintly as if remembering how to glow. The air was cool, and somewhere in the woods, a night bird called once, low and distant. If you're still with me, let your body mirror hers, shoulders loose, jaw unclenched, breathing slow. This is the reward, not victory, but rest earned through endurance, because every medieval winter ended this way, not with triumph, but with quiet restoration. A woman and her dog, sitting in a house still smelling of smoke and thaw, while outside, the night finally forgets to be cruel. By dawn, the world had turned silver, the kind of morning that felt both ancient and new. Mist rolled low across the ground, wrapping the village in a soft veil that blurred each hard edge. The sun hadn't risen yet, but its promise glowed faintly behind the haze, brushing the horizon with pale gold. Etta stepped outside into the hush, her breath visible in the chill air. The cold no longer cut, it simply lingered, gentle, familiar, tamed. Her dog followed close, trotting quietly at her side, paws pressing soft prints into the wet soil. Together, they climbed the hill beyond her cottage, the one overlooking the stream. The water was flowing now, strong and clear, breaking free of the last crusts of ice. It glittered faintly in the half-light, a mirror for the coming day. Etta crouched near the edge and scooped a handful to her lips. The water was shockingly cold, but pure. It tasted of stone, iron, and something she hadn't known in months. Freshness. She smiled, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. Her dog was already lapping greedily from the stream, tail wagging. The sight warmed her more than the sun ever could. A scholar once wrote, "Though I've never found his name, after great silence, the first sound is holy." Maybe that's why the trickle of the stream felt sacred now. It wasn't just water. It was proof that the world still worked, that the cycle still turned, that nature, despite its cruelty, always came back to grace. Through the fog, the village stirred awake. Thin smoke rose into the gray sky. A rooster called. A door creaked open. Ordinary sounds, yet after months of isolation, they felt symphonic. Her dog barked once, scattering a flock of birds. They burst upward, wings flashing in the pale light. For a moment, the air was full of movement, life, color. Etta laughed softly. "Go on," she whispered. "Chase the sun." She stood and stretched. The stiffness in her limbs remained, but it didn't weigh her down. Every ache felt earned, every breath deliberate. She looked at her hands, cracked, rough, scarred, and instead of pity, felt pride. They were the hands of someone who had learned not to yield. There's a quiet truth. Survival changes what the heart finds beautiful. Etta knew that now. Beauty wasn't meadows or church bells. Beauty was breath in cold air, warmth from a small fire, the loyal sound of paws beside her in the snow. As she turned home, the mist thinned, the roof glistened with dew. The window caught the first light of day, and for a heartbeat, her cottage looked almost holy. The fire inside still flickered, waiting. If your eyes are growing heavy, Let this image hold you. A woman and her dog walking home through morning fog, the earth beneath them, damp but forgiving. Every step leaves a print, but none sink too deep, because that's what the thaw meant, not just the end of cold, but the return of gentleness, the reminder that no winter, no matter how endless, can stop those who keep walking toward the light. By mid-morning, the fog had burned away, and sunlight finally touched the village. It poured over rooftops, glinted in puddles, and caught in the smoke drifting from chimneys. The air felt lighter now, unburdened. You could almost hear the ground exhaling. Etta stood in the yard, sleeves rolled up, hands dark with soil. The cold had taught her stillness, the thaw demanded movement. Her dog circled as she worked, occasionally digging beside her, convinced he was helping. She let him. Every shovel of loosened dirt was a declaration, the first act of spring. The soil was damp but soft, releasing that scent she'd nearly forgotten. Life waking up. A medieval proverb said, "The land must remember the hands that tended it." A hope and a warning. Care leaves echoes. Neglect too. As Etta turned the soil, she thought about that. The earth, like people, didn't forget. It could forgive, but it remembered. Across the valley came faint voices, men calling to oxen, women laughing as they shook linens in the sun. Every sound felt like proof the world had survived itself. Etta smiled. She didn't join them yet. Her work was quieter, slower. She planted something small, onions or herbs, uncertain they'd take. But that wasn't the point. Planting was faith in motion, a yes to tomorrow. Her dog barked at a crow, then returned, panting happily. Thinner now, his winter coat shedding in tufts, but eyes bright. He'd endured too, though he'd never name it that way. Animals don't romanticize survival, they just live it. A wisdom Etta respected. She paused, wiping her hands on her skirt, looking across the thawed fields, muddy, patchy, still scarred by frost. Not pretty yet, but full of promise. The ugliness before bloom, the stillness before sound. The world, imperfect and alive. A chronicler once wrote, "Spring begins not when the earth softens, but when the heart does." Etta believed that, though she couldn't have said it aloud. Her thaw wasn't just in the ground, it was in her. The fear that had sat in her chest all winter was gone. What replaced it wasn't joy, but steadiness, a quiet peace that asked for nothing, only presence. She straightened, stretched, and looked toward her cottage. Smoke rose from the chimney. The scent of broth drifted through the air. Her dog was already waiting at the door. She smiled, brushed off her palms, and followed him. Inside, the fire burned low, not out of need, but habit. She stirred the pot, poured a bowl, set another at her companion's feet. The sound of his eager eating filled the room, warm and familiar. If you're still listening, breathe in that moment the scent of soil, smoke, and simmering soup. Feel the quiet certainty of life finding its rhythm again. Because this is how history really moved, not through kings or conquests, but through mornings like this. A woman planting in thawed earth, a loyal dog at her feet, and the sun finally strong enough to stay. By late afternoon, sunlight cut through the cottage window in long, golden beams, dividing the room into strips of warmth and shadow. Dust floated lazily, swirling in slow spirals. Outside, the fields shimmered with a thin film of water, winter's last trace, retreating inch by inch. Etta sat by the hearth, hands in her lap, the smell of broth still clinging to her clothes. She was tired, but not from hunger or fear. It was a clean exhaustion, the kind that follows work done with purpose. Her dog lay near the door, head on his paws, eyes half-lidded. Every so often, his tail twitched, or an ear flicked toward a sound, a child's laugh, a hammer's thud, a bird testing its first spring song. The world was filling with sound again, and it no longer startled him. Etta watched the fire curl and bend. The logs burned steadily, their crackle calm, their heat soft rather than fierce. It struck her how the fire's meaning had changed. Once it had been defense, a fragile barrier between life and death. Now it was comfort, a quiet companion. The fire was no longer a question. It was an answer. A 14th century contemplative once wrote, "Peace arrives not when struggle ends, but when the soul ceases to measure it." That was what she felt now, a slow, unmeasured peace. Not triumph, not relief, just acceptance, the kind that seeps in when you stop waiting for disaster. Outside, the sky deepened to blue, dusk pooling at the hills. Etta rose, wrapped her shawl tight, and stepped into the cooling air. The mud had begun to firm, puddles shrinking, the ground remembering its strength. Her breath still showed, faintly, a ghost of the cold, not its presence. Her dog bounded ahead, chasing the low sunlight across the fields. He barked once, the sound carrying in the stillness. She smiled, following at her own pace, boots squelching in the damp earth. The wind brushed her face, not winter's bite, but the cool whisper of change. Down the lane, a neighbor lifted a child onto his shoulders, pointing toward a sky filled with migrating birds. Their silhouettes stretched long and fluid, wings beating in near-perfect unison. The sight caught her breath, simple, inevitable. The world was repairing itself. She watched until the birds were only specks, then turned back. Her dog waited at the door, tail wagging in patient arcs. Inside, the firelight painted the walls gold. She knelt, ran her fingers through her companion's fur, and whispered, "We made it." Not as a triumph, but a truth too big for celebration, too sacred for words. If you're still here, listening as her story fades, let this be the image that stays. A woman, her dog, and the last light of day falling across a cottage that no longer feels like refuge, but home. Because that's what every long winter teaches in the end. Survival isn't the prize. Continuity is. To wake, to work, to rest, and to stay. That's the quiet, immortal victory of those who endure. By nightfall, the sky had settled into soft indigo, that gentle hour between exhaustion and rest. The stars were faint, but visible, scattered like dust over the quiet horizon. Smoke rose in thin trails from the cottages, curling into the still air. The world had gone calm, not empty, but full of peace, full of exhalation, full of things no longer struggling. Etta sat at her wooden table, a candle flickering before her. Its flame danced low, steady and warm. The day's work had left her sore, but her heart felt light in a way she hadn't known for months. Her dog lay beside her, asleep, chin resting on her boot. The rhythm of his breathing filled the silence between the pops of the fire. She didn't need music. This was enough. On the table lay a few early onions, a piece of bread, and a small cup of ale. It wasn't abundance, but it was comfort, and comfort after such a winter was luxury. She tore off a piece of bread, eyes fixed on the flame. Not long ago, she'd counted every log, every crumb, every hour until dawn. Now, she measured her world in breaths, in quiet satisfaction. An old homily said, "Gratitude is the last warmth before sleep." The priests meant it spiritually, but for Etta, it was literal. Gratitude had become warmth, not in her body, but in her mind, glowing steady beneath everything else. She leaned back and closed her eyes. Candlelight flickered gold and red behind her lids. The sounds of the village drifted faintly through the night. A distant bark, a door closing, the creak of settling wood. Every sound told the same story. People were resting again. The world was back in rhythm. Her dog stirred, gave a low sigh, and pressed closer. She rested her hand on his back, feeling the warmth beneath her palm. That small connection between hand and heartbeat was enough to remind her of everything she'd endured. Winter hadn't broken her, it had refined her. Outside, the moon climbed higher, casting a silver sheen across the fields where water pooled like glass. Tomorrow would bring work, planting, rebuilding, planning, but tonight was for stillness, for remembering that survival isn't noise or motion, but rest earned through hardship. A mystic once wrote, "The soul finds peace not in triumph, but in the quiet after." That was this, the quiet after, the long exhale, the pause between one life and the next. If you're listening, drift there too. Picture the candles glow, the hum of fire, the steady breath of a loyal companion beside you. Feel the air, neither cold nor warm, balanced, safe, whole, because this is the heart of endurance. Not the storm, not the struggle, but the stillness after, when the heart finally believes it can rest. Etta's eyes grew heavy. The candle burned low, and as she leaned into the quiet, her dog's breathing matched her own. Two steady rhythms in a world that had, at last, remembered how to be kind. By dawn, the world was gold again. The first sunlight of spring spilled across the hills, turning puddles into mirrors and grass into glass. The air was cool but gentle, carrying renewal, not threat. Smoke rose from cottages like sighs of survivors. The long silence had ended. The world was awake. Etta stepped outside, eyes narrowing against the brightness. Her dog bounded ahead, tail wagging, barking at nothing in particular. The sound echoed down the slope, clear, certain, alive. She smiled, her breath visible for a heartbeat before the warmth swallowed it whole. She walked to the field's edge. The soil beneath her boots was firming again, drying under the sun. The land looked wounded but alive, muddy, furrowed, scarred with frost, yet glinting with possibility. She knelt, scooped a handful of soil, pressed it between her fingers. It crumbled easily, ready, forgiving. A medieval scholar once wrote, "The earth remembers those who endure it." Maybe that's why she felt seen now, as if the ground itself acknowledged her patience. She whispered, "You kept your promise," unsure whether she spoke to the soil, the sun, or time itself. Her dog ran ahead, chasing starlings that burst from the reeds like sparks. They scattered, rose, and turned as one, dark shapes cutting across the light. For a moment, the sky seemed alive. Etta laughed, not loud, but free. From the ridge, she saw smoke rising from other cottages, thin trails twisting upward. She imagined her neighbors stepping into the same morning, testing the air, realizing they had made it too. The world had moved on, and they had moved with it. An old homily said, "Spring is God's reminder that mercy never ends, only pauses." Mercy wasn't only divine, it was human. Warmth shared in famine, bread split in silence, a fire tended for two instead of one. Mercy was Etta and her companion, waiting for the world to soften. She returned home, sunlight streaming through the window, painting the walls gold. The fire inside had burned low, content to rest. Her dog flopped onto his blanket, tired from joy. Etta poured water into a cup, drank slowly, then sat beside him. The air smelled of smoke, earth, and morning, simple and complete. She rested her hand on his side. His heartbeat thudded steady beneath her fingers, proof that life endures in its quietest forms. She closed her eyes, leaned against the wall, and exhaled. For the first time since the frost, her breath was not defiance. It was simply living. If you're still listening, maybe half asleep, let this be your final image. Sunlight spilling into a quiet home, the last embers of winter glowing in the hearth, and a woman who's learned survival isn't strength, but softness repeated until the storm gives up. Because that's how every endless winter ends, not with thunder or triumph, but with peace, with the world exhaling, with the earth remembering your patience, and with the calm certainty that after the coldest season, life always finds its way back to warmth.